Frank Miller walked quickly through the busy hallways of the television studio. He checked his watch and frowned. Only 2 hours remained until the live taping of The Daily Show, and there was still so much to do. As the head producer, Frank felt the weight of responsibility for tonight's episode. This wasn't just any show. Tonight, Jon Stewart would interview Karoline Leavitt, and everyone expected fireworks. "Have you seen the latest polling numbers?" Lisa Johnson asked, falling into step beside Frank. Lisa had been a writer for the show for 5 years. Her clever jokes and sharp political insights had earned her Jon's trust and respect. "They just came in. Our viewers are definitely going to want Jon to press her hard on these issues." Frank nodded as he accepted the folder Lisa handed him. "Jon's already planning to. You know how he gets when he thinks someone is being dishonest with the public." They pushed through a set of double doors into the main production area. The room buzzed with activity as crew members adjusted lights, tested microphones, and prepared graphics for the show. In the center of it all stood Jon Stewart, reading through notes and occasionally making changes with a red pen. "Got those numbers you wanted," Frank said, approaching Jon and handing over the folder. Jon flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages quickly. A small smile formed at the corner of his mouth. "This is good. This is very good." He looked up at Frank. "Is she here yet?" "Her car just pulled up outside. She should be in the green room in about 10 minutes. Jon nodded and closed the folder. "Make sure we have those clips ready to play, the ones where she contradicts herself. I want them queued up exactly when I signal." "Already done," Frank assured him. "Control room has them ready to go." On the other side of the building, a black car pulled up to the private entrance of the studio. The driver got out and opened the back door. Karoline Leavitt stepped out, dressed in a navy blue suit. At 25 years old, she was one of the youngest press secretaries ever to serve in her position. Despite her youth, she had quickly developed a reputation for her confident handling of the press. "Thank you," she said to the driver before turning to the man waiting at the door. He wore a headset and carried a clipboard. "Ms. Leavitt, I'm Sam. I'll be escorting you to the green room. The show starts in about 90 minutes, but we'll need you for a quick sound check in 30. Karoline smiled politely. "Lead the way." As they walked through the backstage area, Karoline felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. She pulled it out to find a message from her boss. "Remember what we discussed. Stay on message. Don't let him rattle you." She typed a quick reply, "I'm ready," before putting her phone away. The green room was comfortable enough, with a small sofa, a television monitor showing the studio feed, and a table with bottles of water and light snacks. Karoline sat down and opened her briefing folder, reviewing key points one last time. She had been preparing for this interview for days. Her team had watched hours of Jon Stewart's previous interviews, studying his techniques and common traps. Sam returned 30 minutes later to take her for the sound check. "Just need to make sure your microphone is working properly," he explained as he led her onto the set. The studio was larger than it appeared on television. Rows of audience seats stretched back into darkness. Technicians moved around the stage, adjusting equipment and checking settings. A woman approached with a small microphone. "I need to clip this to your jacket," she explained. "Is that okay?" Karoline nodded and stood still while the woman attached the microphone. "Testing 1, 2, 3, Karoline said when prompted. "Perfect." The woman replied, "You're all set." Back in the green room, Karoline found herself alone again. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about all the preparation she had done, all the possible questions and attacks she might face. She knew Jon Stewart's reputation. He was skilled at making his guests look foolish, especially those from the opposite political side. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from her younger sister. "You've got this. Remember, he's just a comedian." Karoline smiled at that. It was both true and not true. Jon Stewart was indeed a comedian, but he was also one of the most influential political commentators in the country. His jokes carried weight. His criticism could shape public opinion. In the control room, Frank watched as the audience filed in. The energy was building. People chatted excitedly, looking forward to tonight's show. They knew who the guest was. They knew Jon's feelings about her policies. They were expecting a show. 10 minutes to air, called out the floor director. Frank walked over to Jon, who was getting a last-minute touch-up from the makeup artist. "How are you feeling?" "Ready," Jon replied. "Is she nervous?" "Hard to tell. She seems pretty composed," Jon nodded. "They always start that way." At 5 minutes to air, Sam returned to the green room. "It's time, Ms. Leavitt." Karoline stood, smoothed her jacket, and followed him. As they approached the stage, she could hear the warm-up comedian getting the audience excited. The laughter and applause grew louder. "You'll wait here until you're introduced," Sam explained, positioning her just offstage. "Then just walk out, shake Jon's hand, and take a seat." Karoline nodded. Her heart was beating faster now, but she kept her expression neutral. She watched as Jon took his place at the desk and the show began. The first segment went as expected. Jon talked about current events, made jokes at the expense of various politicians, and the audience laughed appreciatively. Then, after a commercial break, it was time. "Tonight's guest has become one of the most visible faces of the current administration," Jon said to the camera. "At just 25 years old, she's taken on the role of defending some of the most controversial policies we've seen in recent years. Please welcome Karoline Leavitt." The audience applauded, though not as warmly as they had for Jon. Some people clapped politely, while others seemed to be holding back, waiting to see what would happen. Karoline walked onto the stage with a smile. She shook Jon's hand firmly and took her seat across from him. "Thank you for having me," she said. "Thank you for coming," Jon replied. "I have to say, I'm a little surprised you agreed to this interview. Your office hasn't exactly been friendly to this show in the past." "Well, I believe in engaging with all types of media," Karoline responded smoothly. "Even those who might not agree with our positions." Jon leaned back in his chair. "That's very diplomatic of you." There was a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "So let's start with something simple. How do you prepare for your daily press briefings? It must be challenging to keep up with the constantly changing positions." And with that, the battle had begun. The first shot had been fired. Frank watched from the control room, a small smile playing on his lips. This was going to be good television. Karoline did not miss the implication in Jon's question. But instead of becoming defensive, she smiled. "Actually, Jon, preparation is key to any communication role. I spend hours every day making sure I understand not just what our policies are, but why they matter to everyday Americans. That's something I take very seriously." Jon nodded, his expression suggesting he wasn't quite satisfied with that answer. "Let's talk about some specific policies then. Last week, you stated that the administration strongly supported increasing funding for public education. Yet just 3 months ago, the same administration proposed cutting that very same budget. How do you explain that to the American people?" In the control room, Frank signaled to the team. "Get ready with clip 3. The stage lights seemed suddenly brighter to Karoline. She knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge was still to come. The studio lights felt hot on Karoline's face as she considered Jon's question about the education budget. She knew this was a trap. Answer too defensively, and she would look guilty. Ignore the contradiction, and she would appear dishonest. "That's a fair question," Karoline said, keeping her voice steady. "What many people don't realize is that the initial proposal was part of a larger plan to restructure how education funds are distributed. The goal was always to ensure resources reach students who need them most. The recent increase actually builds on that same commitment." Jon raised his eyebrows and looked directly at the camera before turning back to Karoline. The audience laughed, recognizing his signature expression of disbelief. So cutting money and then adding money are the same thing? That's an interesting approach to math, Jon said. The audience laughed louder. In the control room, Frank watched the monitors with growing excitement. He spoke into his headset to the graphics team. Get ready with the comparison charts. On stage, Jon continued. Let's look at what you actually said 3 months ago. He turned to one of the screens beside them. Can we roll that clip, please? The screen showed Karoline at a press briefing from 3 months earlier. In the clip, she stated clearly, "This administration believes the current education budget is bloated with unnecessary programs. The proposed adjustments will eliminate waste while preserving essential services." The clip ended, and Jon turned back to Karoline. "And now you're saying more funding is needed. Which is it?" The audience murmured. Some people clapped, clearly enjoying seeing Karoline put on the spot. Paul Harrison, the director, moved between cameras, making sure to capture both Jon's confident expressions and Karoline's reactions. "Camera 2. Tighten on her face," he instructed. "I want to see if she's sweating." Karoline took a small sip of water from the glass on the table beside her. She had anticipated this tactic, using her own words against her. She placed the glass down carefully. "Context matters, Jon," she replied. "In the previous statement, I was referring specifically to administrative overhead that wasn't reaching classrooms. The new funding is directed entirely to teacher salaries and classroom resources. So yes, we cut waste while increasing support for what actually helps students. Both statements are consistent with our values." Jon leaned forward, his smile never leaving his face, but his eyes remained serious. "That's a convenient explanation. But let's move on to something else." He shuffled his notes. "Your administration has made some bold claims about job creation. You stated last month that employment is at an all-time high under the current policies." On the monitors in the control room, graphics appeared showing employment statistics. Frank nodded with satisfaction. The data was presented in a way that contradicted Karoline's claims. "Ready with the employment chart," the graphics technician confirmed through the headset. "Put it up," Frank ordered. On stage, Jon gestured to the screen where a chart now appeared. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, job growth has actually slowed by nearly 15% compared to the previous administration. How do you explain that discrepancy? The audience was fully engaged now, many nodding along with Jon's points. This was exactly what they had come to see. Jon Stewart using facts and humor to corner a political figure. Karoline glanced at the chart. She noticed immediately that it only showed data from certain sectors of the economy, not the complete picture. This was another common tactic, using selective statistics to support a predetermined narrative. "That's an interesting chart," she said, keeping her tone conversational rather than accusatory. "But it only shows manufacturing and retail sectors. When we look at the complete data including technology, healthcare, and green energy jobs, the picture is quite different." Jon interrupted. "So you're saying the Bureau of Labor Statistics is wrong?" "Not at all," Karoline replied. "I'm saying that chart isn't showing the complete data set. The Bureau's comprehensive report, which came out just 2 weeks ago, shows overall job growth at 3.2% year over year." In the audience, a man named Greg Wilson leaned toward his friend. "She's not backing down like the others usually do," he whispered. His friend nodded. "Yeah, but Stewart's just warming up." Back in the control room, Frank frowned slightly. This wasn't going exactly as planned. Karoline was more prepared than they had anticipated. He spoke into his headset again. "Tell Jon to move to the immigration questions. We have better material there." On stage, Jon shifted in his chair. "Let's talk about immigration policy," he said, changing direction smoothly. Last week, you defended what many are calling the harshest border policies in decades. How do you square that with previous statements about America being a nation of immigrants? The audience grew quiet, sensing the increased seriousness of the topic. Karoline took a moment before answering. Immigration was perhaps the most divisive issue she dealt with in press briefings. She needed to be precise. America has always been and will always be a nation of immigrants, she began. My own grandparents came to this country with nothing but hope for a better life. What we're advocating for isn't anti-immigrant, it's pro-legal immigration. The policies aim to create a system that's fair, orderly, and humane. Jon didn't miss a beat. Humane? There are reports of families being separated, people held in overcrowded facilities. Is that your definition of humane? The audience murmured their agreement with Jon's point. Those situations are precisely what the new policies are designed to prevent, Karoline responded. The previous system created dangerous incentives that put vulnerable people at risk. Reform is difficult and sometimes messy, but the goal is to create a system that works better for everyone, especially those seeking to come here legally. Jon looked down at his notes, then back up with a skeptical expression. Let's be honest here. These policies seem designed to appeal to a specific base of voters rather than actually solve problems. The audience applauded, and several people cheered. In the green room, several staff members were watching the interview on a monitor. One of them, a young man named Ryan Cooper, shook his head. Stewart's really going after her. His colleague nodded. That's why people watch. He says what regular journalists won't. On stage, Karoline remained composed despite the audience's clear support for Jon. Policy should be about solving real problems, not scoring political points, she said. I'd be happy to discuss the specific details of the immigration reform package, which includes increased resources for processing asylum claims, improved conditions at border facilities, and partnerships with countries of origin to address root causes of migration. Jon looked directly at the camera again, making a comical expression of exaggerated boredom. The audience laughed on cue. That sounds like a prepared talking point rather than a real answer, Jon said after the laughter died down. Karoline smiled. Slightly. It's both, Jon. It's a real answer that I've prepared because it's important to be accurate about complex issues. Jon shuffled his notes again. Let's move on to climate policy. In the control room, Frank spoke urgently into his headset. We're not getting what we need. Tell Jon to be more direct with her. We need a viral moment. Lisa Johnson, who had been watching silently from the corner of the control room, stepped closer to Frank. She's good, she said quietly. Better than we expected. Frank nodded grimly. Jon will find a way to break through. He always does. Back on stage, Jon was setting up his next line of questioning. The studio lights seemed to intensify as the interview entered its most challenging phase. The real test for Karoline was just beginning. Jon Stewart leaned forward, his expression changing to one of greater intensity. The casual humor that had carried the first part of the interview was fading. He was moving in for what the production team hoped would be the decisive moment. Let's talk about climate change, Jon said. Your administration has rolled back environmental protections while claiming to care about the future of our planet. How do you explain that contradiction to the young people who will have to live with the consequences? The audience grew very quiet. Climate change was an issue that many of them felt passionate about. In the control room, Frank watched closely. Stay on this topic, he said into his headset. We've got good material here. Karoline nodded, acknowledging the seriousness of the question. Environmental policy requires balance, she began. We all want clean air and water. We all want to protect natural spaces. The disagreement isn't about goals, but about methods. Jon interrupted. Methods? Let's be specific. Your administration canceled the green energy initiative that scientists widely supported. You've opened protected lands for drilling. These aren't differences in method. They're completely opposite approaches." The audience applauded, many nodding in agreement. "What many people don't realize," Karoline continued when the applause died down, "is that the Green Energy Initiative had serious flaws in its implementation plan. Our approach focuses on market-based solutions and technological innovation rather than government mandates. And regarding land use, we've actually designated more protected wilderness areas than the previous administration." Jon looked directly into the camera with an expression of disbelief. The audience laughed. "Market-based solutions," Jon repeated, making air quotes with his fingers. "That sounds like code for let companies do whatever makes them the most money. More." Laughter and applause followed. Karoline remained composed, though she felt her patience being tested. She recognized Jon was using a common debate tactic, mischaracterizing her position to make it sound unreasonable. "That's not accurate, Jon," she said firmly. "Our policies include strict penalties for polluters. What we oppose are regulations that hurt working families while having minimal environmental benefit. For example, the new clean energy tax credits have already led to a 23% increase in solar installations this year alone." Jon seemed slightly thrown by her specific statistic. He glanced down at his notes dot in the control room. Lisa quickly typed on her tablet, checking Karoline's claim. "That number is actually correct," she said to Frank with surprise. "She came prepared." Frank frowned. "Tell Jon to move on to the social media posts. That's our strongest material." Back on stage, Jon shifted gears. "I'd like to ask about some statements you've made on social media. You've called climate activists alarmists and suggested that environmental concerns are overblown. Do you stand by those comments?" The screen beside them displayed screenshots of social media posts attributed to Karoline from several years earlier. Karoline looked at the screen, then back at Jon. "Those posts are from when I was in college, before I worked in government. And they're being shown without context. My views, like many people's, have evolved over time. What I was criticizing then wasn't environmental protection itself, but the tendency of some to use apocalyptic language that can paralyze rather than motivate action." Jon pressed further. "So you're saying you no longer believe what you wrote?" "I'm saying that simplified statements on social media rarely capture the full complexity of issues like climate policy. My work now focuses on solutions that are both environmentally responsible and economically viable." In the audience, a woman named Mary Turner whispered to her husband, "She's not cracking under pressure like they usually do." Her husband nodded. "Stewart seems a bit frustrated." He was right. Jon was showing subtle signs of irritation. This interview wasn't following the usual pattern where his guests became defensive or flustered. He decided to take a more direct approach. "Let's be honest here," Jon said, his tone more serious than before. "Your job is essentially to defend policies that often contradict each other. How do you look yourself in the mirror, knowing that you're sometimes telling the public things that simply aren't true?" A hush fell over the studio. This was no longer about specific policies. It was a direct challenge to Karoline's integrity. Paul, the director, zoomed in on Karoline's face, expecting to capture a moment of shock or anger. Instead, she took a deep breath and met Jon's gaze steadily. "That's a very loaded question, Jon," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It assumes I'm being dishonest, which I reject completely. I believe in the work I'm doing. I believe in being truthful with the American people, even when the truth is complicated or doesn't fit into a neat sound bite." Jon didn't back down. "But surely there have been times when you've had to defend positions you personally disagree with. That's the nature of your job, isn't it? Every person who works in government occasionally disagrees with specific decisions," Karoline acknowledged. "That's normal in any organization. But I would never deliberately mislead the public. If I fundamentally disagreed with the administration's values or direction, I wouldn't be in this role." The audience was completely silent now, watching the exchange with rapt attention. This wasn't the comedy they had expected. It had become something more substantive. In the control room, Frank was growing increasingly concerned. "This isn't working," he muttered to Lisa. "She's too composed. Tell Jon to use the video montage we prepared." Lisa hesitated. "Are you sure? That's pretty aggressive material." "That's why we need it," Frank insisted. "We need a moment that will go viral." Lisa nodded reluctantly and relayed the message to Jon through his earpiece. On stage, Jon's expression changed slightly as he received the instruction. He looked down at his notes, then back up at Karoline. "I'd like to show you something," he said. "We've put together a short video that highlights some contradictions we've noticed." The screens beside them came to life with a carefully edited montage of clips. It showed Karoline making statements on various issues, followed immediately by clips that seemed to contradict those statements. The editing was skillful, designed to make the contradictions appear as blatant as possible. As the video played, the audience began to react with murmurs and occasional laughter. The montage ended with dramatic music and a question appearing on screen. "Can we trust anything she says?" When the video ended, Jon turned back to Karoline. "Care to comment on that?" Doug Peterson, the sound engineer, adjusted his headphones. "This is it," he said quietly to himself. "This is where she falls apart." Beth Andrews, watching from the production area, wasn't so sure. Something about Karoline's demeanor throughout the interview suggested she wouldn't be easily rattled. Karoline had watched the montage with a neutral expression. Inside, she recognized the manipulation at work, clips taken out of context, statements about different aspects of issues presented as direct contradictions, time frames compressed to make normal policy evolution seem like flip-flopping. This was the moment that would define the interview. Her response would either vindicate the show's approach or turn the tables. The studio was completely silent after the video montage ended. All eyes were on Karoline. Jon Stewart sat back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He believed he had finally cornered her with evidence she couldn't talk her way around. Karoline took a moment before responding. When she spoke, her voice was measured and clear. "That was an interesting piece of editing," she said. "But it doesn't reflect reality. What your audience just saw were clips taken out of context, some from different years, some referring to completely different aspects of the same issues. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes Americans distrust media." Jon's smile faded slightly. He hadn't expected her to directly challenge the validity of their video. "So you're saying we manufactured those contradictions?" Jon asked, his tone slightly defensive. "I'm saying that putting statements side by side that were made months apart, about different circumstances, creates an impression of contradiction where none exists," Karoline replied. "Policy evolves as situations change. That's not hypocrisy, it's responsible governance." In the control room, Frank turned to Lisa with a concerned expression. "This isn't going as planned," he said quietly. Lisa nodded. "She's not playing by the usual rules. Most guests get defensive or angry when cornered. She's staying on message and questioning our methods instead." Back on stage, Jon was trying to regain control of the interview. "Let's get specific then," he said. "In the video, we showed you stating clearly that the administration opposed any tax increases. Yet 3 weeks later, you defended the new corporate minimum tax. That seems like a direct contradiction." Karoline nodded. "I understand why it might appear that way. The first statement was about personal income taxes, which we continue to oppose raising. The corporate minimum tax is about closing loopholes. That allows some large companies to pay nothing while small businesses pay their fair share. These are consistent positions serving the same goal, a fair tax system." Jon looked slightly frustrated. "That's a convenient explanation." "It's not about convenience, Jon. It's about accuracy. Karoline responded. These nuances matter. When media outlets, even comedy shows, flatten complex issues into simplified gotcha moments, the public loses valuable context for understanding policy decisions. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some people exchanged glances. This wasn't the entertaining takedown they had expected. Instead, they were witnessing something more like a serious debate. In the audience, Greg Wilson leaned forward in his seat. He had come expecting to see Jon Stewart demolish another political figure. Instead, he found himself listening closely to Karoline's points. She's actually making sense, he whispered to his friend. Yeah, his friend replied. I'm kind of impressed she's not getting rattled. Jon could sense the shift in the room's energy. He needed to change tactics. You know, he said, his tone becoming more casual, what's interesting to me is how someone your age ended up in this position. You're what, 25? And you're the face of an administration making decisions that affect millions of lives. Doesn't that ever feel overwhelming? It was a subtle shift, moving from attacking her statements to questioning her qualifications based on age. Jon hoped this approach might provoke a more emotional response. Karoline recognized the strategy for what it was. My age comes up a lot, she said with a small smile. I understand the curiosity. But think about it this way. Every generation should have a voice in the policies that will shape their future. Young people will live with the consequences of today's decisions longer than anyone else. That perspective matters. She continued. And yes, the responsibility is enormous. I don't take it lightly, but I didn't walk into this role without preparation. I've worked in politics and communications since college, learning from experienced mentors and building the skills needed for this position. Jon nodded, then shifted gears again. Let's talk about your boss for a moment, he said. Many people, including some from your own party, have questioned his leadership style. How do you respond to critics who say the administration lacks a coherent vision? In the control room, Frank spoke urgently into his headset. We're running out of time. Push harder on the leadership question. That's our last chance to get a reaction. Paul, the director, signaled to camera 3 to zoom in. Tight on Karoline's face. He wanted to capture any hint of discomfort at this direct question about her boss. Karoline knew this question was designed to put her in an impossible position. Defend her boss too strongly, and she would seem blindly loyal. Express any doubt, and it would become the headline. Leadership takes many forms, she began. Some leaders are loud and flashy. Others are more deliberate and focused on results rather than headlines. This administration has a clear vision: economic opportunity, national security, and individual liberty. The methods for achieving those goals adapt to changing circumstances as they should. Jon looked skeptical. That sounds like a prepared statement rather than an honest assessment. It's both honest and prepared, Karoline replied. I believe in the work we're doing, and I've thought deeply about how to communicate that work clearly. Being prepared doesn't make a statement less truthful. Jon glanced at his notes, then back at Karoline. She had managed to deflect or counter every line of questioning so far. He decided to try one final approach. I'm just trying to understand, Jon said, leaning forward, how someone with your intelligence and obvious communication skills can stand at that podium day after day and say things that fact-checkers routinely dispute. Doesn't that ever trouble your conscience? The question hung in the air. It was no longer about specific policies or statements. Jon was challenging Karoline's personal integrity, suggesting she was knowingly misleading the public. Beth Andrews, watching from the production area, held her breath. This is it, she whispered to a colleague. If anything's going to break her, it's this. The audience was completely silent, waiting for Karoline's response. Even those who had come expecting to see her embarrassed felt the weight of the moment. Karoline looked directly at Jon. For the first time in the interview, there was a hint of genuine emotion in her expression, Not anger or defensiveness, but a quiet determination. "You know, Jon," she said, her voice calm but firm, "before I came on your show tonight, many people warned me. They said you would try to trap me in gotcha moments rather than have a substantive discussion. They said you're more interested in making people look foolish than in understanding different perspectives." Jon raised his eyebrows, surprised by this direct challenge to his approach. "But I agreed to come anyway," Karoline continued, "because I believed we could have a real conversation about issues that matter to Americans. I respect your intelligence and your influence. I think your audience deserves more than rehearsed takedowns and edited montages designed to make me look dishonest." The studio was absolutely still. Even the crew members had stopped moving, watching the unexpected turn the interview had taken. "I stand by my work," Karoline said. "I believe in being truthful with the American people. That doesn't mean I never make mistakes or that policies never change. But I reject the idea that disagreeing with your political perspective makes me dishonest." Jon Stewart sat back in his chair, momentarily at a loss for words. This wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. Instead of becoming defensive or angry, Karoline had directly challenged the premise and methods of his interview. In the control room, Frank and Lisa exchanged shocked looks. This wasn't at all what they had planned. The studio remained silent for several long seconds after Karoline finished speaking. Jon Stewart looked down at his desk, then back up at his guest. Something had shifted in the room. The audience, who had come expecting entertainment at Karoline's expense, were now fully engaged in what had become a serious conversation about media, politics, and truth. "That's actually a fair point," Jon finally said, his tone more genuine than at any previous moment in the interview. In the control room, Frank stared at the monitor in disbelief. Did he just agree with her? He asked no one in particular. Lisa nodded slowly. "I think he did." On stage, Jon leaned forward. "So let's do that then," he said. "Let's have a real conversation without the gotcha moments. Pick an issue you think is important and that you feel is often misrepresented, and let's talk about it." Karoline looked surprised. She hadn't expected Jon to pivot so completely. She had prepared for continued attacks, not an invitation to genuine dialogue. "Healthcare is a good example," she said after a moment. "The debate is often framed as government-run healthcare versus no healthcare for those who can't afford it. But that's a false choice that ignores the real solutions many of us are working toward." Jon nodded. "Go on." "The goal should be making quality healthcare accessible to every American," Karoline continued. "Where we differ is in how to achieve that. Our approach focuses on increasing competition among providers, reducing regulatory barriers that drive up costs, and targeting assistance to those who truly need it rather than creating a one-size-fits-all system." Instead of immediately challenging her, Jon asked, "What specific policies do you think would make the biggest difference?" "Price transparency is huge," Karoline replied, warming to the topic. "Americans should know what medical procedures cost before they receive them. That alone would transform the market. We also need to address the shortage of doctors by expanding medical school capacity and streamlining the process for qualified foreign doctors to practice here." In the audience, Mary Turner whispered to her husband, "This is actually interesting. I never heard these ideas explained this way before." Her husband nodded. "It's amazing what happens when people actually listen to each other." Back in the control room, Frank was pacing nervously. "This isn't what the audience came for," he muttered. "We need to wrap this up." "I'm not so sure," Lisa replied, watching the monitors. "Look at the audience. They're engaged. This might actually be good television." On stage, Jon and Karoline continued their conversation, which had evolved into a substantive discussion about policy differences. Jon still challenged Karoline's points, but now he did so respectfully, without the sarcasm and gotcha tactics that had characterized the earlier part of the interview. "I still disagree with several of your approaches," Jon said, "but I appreciate you explaining the reasoning behind them. Too often in political media, we focus on scoring points rather than understanding different perspectives." Karoline nodded. "That's exactly the problem. When everything becomes about winning the moment rather than solving problems, the American people lose. They deserve better from both politicians and the media." Doug Peterson, the sound engineer, removed his headphones. Briefly, "Is this really happening?" he asked the technician next to him. "Stewart's having an actual conversation with her." "Never seen anything like it," the technician replied. As the interview drew to a close, Jon looked directly at Karoline. "I want to thank you for coming on the show tonight. I think this conversation took an unexpected turn, but a valuable one." "I appreciate that," Karoline replied. "And I appreciate you being willing to shift gears when I called out what was happening. That shows integrity." The audience applauded, louder and more genuinely than they had at any previous point in the show. As the cameras pulled back and the show went to commercial, Jon stood and extended his hand to Karoline. "That was not what I expected," he said quietly. "Me neither," she admitted with a small smile. In the green room afterward, Sam approached Karoline with wide eyes. "That was incredible," he said. "Everyone backstage is talking about it. You completely changed the dynamic of the interview." Karoline took a bottle of water from the table. "I just decided to be direct about what was happening rather than playing along with the usual game." Meanwhile, Jon had returned to his office where Frank and Lisa were waiting. Frank looked worried. "That's not the kind of segment we usually do," he said. Jon sat down at his desk. "No, it's not. But maybe that's not a bad thing." He looked thoughtful. "She made some valid points about how we approach these interviews. Maybe we've gotten too formulaic, too focused on embarrassing our guests rather than having real conversations." "The audience seemed to respond well by the end," Lisa observed. "Different from the usual laughs, but they were definitely engaged." "Run the full interview without heavy editing," Jon decided. "Let's see how viewers respond to something more substantive." The next morning, clips from the interview began circulating online. To everyone's surprise, the moment that went viral wasn't one of Jon's clever takedowns or Karoline's defenses of controversial policies. Instead, it was the turning point when she directly challenged the show's approach, and Jon responded by shifting to a genuine conversation. Social media exploded with comments from viewers across the political spectrum. "Never thought I'd see the day when Jon Stewart would be called out on his own show, and then actually listen. Don't agree with her politics, but respect how she handled herself. Wish more political conversations were like this. Most refreshing interview I've seen in years. Can we have more of this and less gotcha journalism?" News outlets picked up the story, with headlines like "Karoline Leavitt turns the tables on Jon Stewart, and a moment of genuine political dialogue breaks out" on late-night TV. A week later, in her office at the White House, Karoline received a handwritten note from Jon Stewart. It reads simply, "Thank you for the reminder that we can do better. The invitation stands for a follow-up conversation anytime." She smiled and pinned the note to her bulletin board. That evening, during her daily press briefing, a reporter asked about her appearance on The Daily Show. "Many people were surprised by how that interview unfolded," the reporter said. "Do you think it represents a possible shift in how political figures and the media interact?" Karoline looked out at the room full of journalists. "I hope so," she said. "The American people deserve more than sound bites and gotcha moments. They deserve real conversations about issues that affect their lives. Conversations where we listen to understand, not just to respond." In the back of the briefing room, Frank Miller stood quietly, notebook in hand. He had taken a personal day to come observe Karoline in her natural environment. As a producer, he recognized that something significant had happened on his show last week. something that might change how they approached future interviews. As Karoline continued answering questions with the same direct, thoughtful style she had shown on The Daily Show, Frank made notes for a new segment idea. Perhaps there was room in political media for something beyond the usual pattern of attack and defense. Perhaps viewers were hungry for something more substantial. Outside the White House, regular Americans went about their lives, many of them increasingly tired of the constant conflict that characterized political coverage. The Stewart-Leavitt interview had offered a brief glimpse of an alternative, a moment when two people with different perspectives had moved past the performance of conflict to engage in actual dialogue. It was just one interview, just one moment. But sometimes, that's all it takes to start a change.